Under the endless Arizona sky, the land stretched wide and silent, holding its secrets beneath the sweep of wind and the haunting call of coyotes. In that silence, a young cowboy lived with only the creak of his cabin walls and the restless beating of his heart. He was 20, hardened by dust, hunger, and solitude, his hands blistered from splitting wood, his back bent from mending fences that leaned as though even the earth itself had grown tired. The days burned hot, the nights ached with cold, and yet he endured, carrying in his chest a stubborn flame that refused to be put out. He told himself it was survival, but beneath the dust and weariness there was a quiet longing for warmth, for connection, for something or someone that might make the silence less heavy. It was on one such evening, when the air smelled of dry sage and the sky burned red with the last fire of sunset, that he followed the broken trail of his goat into the wash and saw them. Two small figures crouched under the thorny shadow of mesquite, so still they might have been carved from stone, their faces streaked with dirt, their clothes torn, their eyes wide with a mixture of defiance and fear. One girl, older, her gaze sharp like a blade drawn in defense of the younger child who trembled beside her, lips pressed tight as though even crying might give too much away. For a moment, he froze, breath caught in his chest, as if the desert itself had shifted and delivered this fragile mystery into his path. His hand brushed the colt at his hip, then fell away when he realized what they were. Not enemies, not raiders, but children. Apache children, alone where no child should ever be. His heart tightened, not with suspicion, but with a strange, aching tenderness he did not understand. He had seen soldiers march children away in chains, had seen families broken and scattered by raids, and here before him was the living echo of all that cruelty. He could turn away, ride to the fort, and watch them vanish into some dark fate, or he could do the one thing that might bring light into their shadow. Slowly, carefully, he set down his pack, opened it, and laid bread, pork, and water upon a stone. Then, without a word, he stepped back. The older girl watched him with unblinking suspicion, as though every movement was a test of his soul. At last, with a tug at her sister's hand, she crept forward, snatched the food, and ate with desperate hunger. He saw the younger one's hands tremble, saw the way her small body leaned into her sister as if she were the last anchor in the world. He wanted to speak, to say something soft and healing, but words would have been clumsy, heavy, too small for the fragile enormity of that moment. So he simply tipped his hat and walked away, leaving behind not just food, but a fragment of himself he would never get back. And so it began, this unspoken ritual beneath the desert sky. Day after day he left gifts on the stone, beans, jerky, once even an apple he had saved for himself. Always he walked away, giving them space, respecting their silence. Slowly their eyes softened, the fire of suspicion dimmed just enough to reveal the flicker of trust. The younger girl smiled once, quick and fleeting, before hiding again behind her sister's shoulder, and in that brief spark his weary heart felt something he hadn't in years, a warmth that could not be explained, a gentle healing rising out of the loneliness like water from dry rock. Then, one morning, they were gone. No trace but a strip of deerskin tied with blue beads left on the stone where food had always been. He lifted it in his calloused hand, felt its weight, and felt a hollow open inside him so vast it seemed the desert could echo within. For 15 long years he carried that strip in a tobacco tin beside his bed, the only sign that someone, once, had needed him. And in all those years he never forgot the look in their eyes, nor the quiet bond forged in silence and hunger. The land changed with time, and so did he. The boy hardened into a man, broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and loss, his solitude stretching deeper with every passing season. Yet, whenever he turned the beads in his fingers, he felt the memory stir, like a whisper of love not yet spoken, a promise waiting at the edge of tomorrow. The desert had given him 2 souls once, only to take them away. But life is never finished with those who carry hope in silence, and destiny, as vast as the sky itself, was still moving toward him with unseen steps. And so the years folded into one another, until the night the storm came, pounding rain against his cabin roof, and 2 shadows stood again at his door. But that moment belonged to the future, waiting just beyond the horizon. For now, the memory of 2 children in the wash, their dark eyes wide and unyielding, lingered in him like an ember refusing to die. If you feel the gentle pull of this story, if it stirs warmth in your chest or softens a hidden ache, I invite you to linger with me a little longer. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe, so together we can keep weaving these healing tales, stories of love, of fate, of hearts finding one another across years of silence and loss. Because sometimes the most extraordinary romances are born not of grand declarations, but of quiet acts of kindness beneath the endless sky. The silence of the desert held its breath, and with it, so did the heart of a man who had yet to know that love, deep, patient, and unbreakable, was already on its way back to him. And from this stillness, his life was about to turn towards something he had never dared to dream. The years did not rush. They scraped by, slow as stone, worn down by wind. Seasons blurred together until he no longer counted them. The boy who had once left food on a flat rock for 2 starving children had long since become a man weathered by solitude. His cabin stood straighter now, the fence mended, the roof patched, the goats penned and tended with a patience born of repetition. His hair had grown longer, streaked with sun, his shoulders broader, his eyes quieter. He carried no illusions about life. War had taken friends, sickness had taken kin, and time had taken every reason he once had to seek company. Yet one thing endured, a small tobacco tin on the shelf above his bed, holding the strip of deerskin with its blue beads. Sometimes at night he would turn it in his hands, feeling its texture, letting memory rise like smoke, healing and hurting all at once. He often wondered what became of those girls. Did they survive? Did they find their people again, or were they lost to the dark silence that so often swallowed lives in this harsh land? On quiet nights, when the fire was low and the wind pushed hard against the cabin walls, he would catch himself imagining their faces grown, their eyes less fearful, their laughter real. The thought left him with a dull ache, like a wound that never closed. Yet, curiously, it also kept him alive. It reminded him that once, even in his loneliest days, he had been needed. That memory worked like a thread stitched through the torn fabric of his soul, small but steady, pulling him back from despair. It was his secret light, a healing ember hidden deep. Then, On a night when rain hammered down from a sky black as iron, there came a knock at the door. Not timid, not desperate, just two firm raps that cut through the storm. His body tensed. No one came this far unless they carried business or danger. He reached for the latch, the weight of the Colt at his side a familiar comfort. But when the door swung open, the sight before him made his breath catch. Two women stood there, rain running from their hair, dresses clinging to their forms until every line showed. The older held her chin high, her gaze steady, eyes dark and unflinching. The younger stood just behind, shivering from cold, clutching a bundle wrapped in rawhide. And in an instant, recognition struck him. The tilt of the jaw, the way one stood slightly shielded behind the other, the same fierce defiance in the older one's eyes, the same quiet trembling in the younger. 15 years dissolved like mist. The children from the wash had returned, grown, strong, yet still bound to him by a thread he had never cut. They entered without words, their presence filling the cabin with the scent of wet earth and smoke. The older unwrapped her bundle and laid out a piece of leather, stitched with the same blue beads he had kept all these years. He brought down the tobacco tin, set the old strip beside the new, and in the lamplight the beads glimmered like tiny stars. For a moment his throat closed, but no words were needed. The truth hung heavy in the air. They had come back, not by accident, not by chance, but because destiny had circled them back to him. He offered blankets, stoked the fire, poured coffee, set out bread and beans. They ate as they once had, quickly, carefully, though now with the dignity of women who had learned how to hide hunger. When the younger's dress strap tore, he laid one of his shirts on the table. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, and when she returned, her hair damp, shoulders draped in his shirt, she gave him a small nod that seemed to carry the weight of gratitude and trust. Later, when he unrolled his blanket on the floor, the older sister watched him in silence, then reached down with the edge of her own blanket to cover his shoulder. Her hand lingered long enough for him to feel its warmth. He lay awake, listening to their breathing, knowing this was no passing visit. Whatever roads had brought them here had only begun to tell their story. Morning arrived grey and hushed, mist rising from the wash like ghostly breath. He found them already awake, tending the fire, folding blankets as though they belonged here. And strangely, he did not mind. The cabin, long silent, now carried the rhythm of life again. The scrape of the poker in the coals, the soft sweep of fabric against wood, the sound of women moving with purpose. It was a fragile piece, but it was alive, and it seeped into him like warmth into frozen ground. He did not yet know the weight of what their return would mean, how the town would whisper, how the riders would come, how choices would press heavy against his chest. But in that quiet morning, with the smell of coffee and wood smoke drifting through the room, he felt the first stirrings of something he had long thought buried, the beginning of a shared life, of love not spoken in words, but in presence, in trust, in the healing comfort of simply not being alone anymore. The storm had passed, but a greater storm was waiting beyond the ridge, carried on the breath of gossip and the boots of men who thrived on suspicion. Yet for now, as sunlight broke through the mist and touched the cabin roof, he let himself breathe in the fragile peace. The silence of years had broken, and from that fracture, something new, something lasting, was quietly being born. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm that felt both strange and achingly natural, as though life itself had been waiting years for this quiet return. The cabin, once a silent box of wood and stone, now breathed with new presence. Where once only his boots had struck the floorboards, there were now softer steps. Where once only the wind filled the air, there were now the low sounds of women's voices, brief words about firewood, water, or mending. Their silence was not heavy. It was alive, carrying with it the healing hum of belonging. He found himself standing taller, moving with more purpose, as though their nearness had lifted the weight of all those lonely seasons. The older sister carried herself with calm strength, every motion deliberate. When she worked the fire, her arms steady with the poker, or when she hoisted both water pails at once without complaint, he felt something stir in his chest that went beyond admiration. It was respect, woven with a quiet yearning. She was no fragile memory from the past, but a woman of resilience, carved by survival, her presence grounding like stone. The younger one, gentler in her movements, carried a different kind of strength, subtle but no less powerful. Her watchful eyes softened when she stitched his torn shirt by the fire, her hair falling loose around her shoulders as she bent over the needle. He watched the way her fingers moved, precise, tender, and he realized that solitude had never offered him such small mercies before. Even the sight of her mending what was his filled him with a healing warmth, a sense of being cared for in a way he had long forgotten. As the days blended into one another, their presence reshaped the rhythm of the ranch. He rose earlier, not to fight the silence, but to share the morning. When he returned from chopping wood, he would find the table already wiped, blankets neatly folded, and the cabin infused with the smell of bread warming over the stove. He had built this place for one, yet it had begun to shift, to stretch, to hold the lives of three. He noticed how the older sister's laughter, low, rare, but steady, seemed to settle the air like music. He noticed how the younger one's hands lingered on the grain of the table as though claiming it for herself. These things were small, yet they transformed the space, making it feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Still, beneath the surface of this quiet, questions lingered. He wondered where they had been in those 15 years, what dangers had marked their journey, what losses had carved the strength into their faces. Sometimes in the evenings when the firelight flickered against the cabin walls, he would glance at them and almost ask, but something in their silence told him that to press too soon would risk shattering the fragile bond growing between them. And so he waited, letting time do its patient work, letting trust grow like seedlings breaking through stubborn earth. One afternoon, as the sun stretched low over the ridge, he found himself working beside them. Together they hauled water from the spring, repaired the loose fence posts, and cleared a patch of weeds near the cabin. The older sister drove stakes into the earth with an axe head, the muscles in her shoulders flexing with each strike. He tried not to watch too long, but his gaze lingered anyway, tracing the strength in her arms, the steadiness in her stance. The younger sister moved with quick cleverness, looping twine around the posts, her hair catching the sunlight until it glowed like dark fire. When she slipped on a damp plank by the spring and nearly fell, his hands caught her at the waist before thought could intervene. For a breathless moment, her back pressed against his chest, her heart beat fast beneath his palms. She looked over her shoulder, not startled, not fearful, but steady, her gaze meeting his with a quiet recognition that sent warmth flooding through him. She stepped forward then, composed, leaving only the memory of her closeness burning in him like a secret flame. That evening, the air was warm enough that they left the door open, the scent of sage and wood smoke drifting through. He sat at the table oiling an old hinge, and she came to set a cup of coffee beside him. Their hands brushed, and neither pulled away at once. When he lifted his eyes, hers did not drop. Slowly, carefully, he leaned forward, and she tipped her chin just enough. Their lips met softly, cautious at first, but real, more real than anything he had felt in years. The moment stretched, sweet and healing, until the sound of a chair scraped across the floor. They broke apart to see the older sister standing there, her gaze fixed upon them. For an instant he braced for anger, but it never came. Instead, she stepped closer, laid her hand against his jaw, and kissed him herself. Slow, deliberate, with a certainty that stole his breath. No words followed. None were needed. In that quiet, the three of them sat together, the fire snapping, the night drifting in through the open door. The cabin, once a prison of silence, had become something else entirely. Knees touched beneath the table, hands brushed, warmth spread. And when at last they lay down for the night, the air carried no shame, no hesitation, only the unspoken truth that they had chosen one another. For years he had lived as though no future waited for him, as though each day was only a thing to be endured. But now, lying in the glow of the embers with the sound of their breathing near, he felt something shift. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to dream, not of survival, but of life shared, of mornings and nights that mattered because they belonged to more than just himself. Outside, the desert held its quiet vigil, coyotes calling in the distance, the stars wheeling endlessly overhead. But inside that small cabin, the silence was broken forever, and from its fracture a new bond had been born, fragile yet unyielding, warm as fire, steady as stone, carrying with it the promise of healing and of love that would not be turned aside. And though trouble would soon rise like dust on the horizon, for now the night held them safe, and their hearts beat as one. The following mornings carried a rhythm that seemed at once new and yet deeply familiar, as if the land itself had been waiting for this fragile union to return. Dawn broke with the pale wash of gold over the ridge, mist rising from the wash like breath from the earth, and the cabin stirred not with a single man's solitude, but with the subtle sounds of 3 lives woven together. He woke to the scent of coffee and wood smoke, to the faint rustle of fabric as the older sister stirred embers back to life, her braid falling loose over one shoulder, her arms steady as she worked the poker with practiced strength. The younger one crouched near the table, folding blankets with meticulous care, her hair tumbling forward, catching light like a soft veil. He sat up slowly, shoulders stiff from the floorboards, but what had once been discomfort now felt like proof of something shared, a gentle healing that rose not from words but from presence. Breakfast was simple, bread torn carefully, beans ladled from the pot, but the act of eating together felt weightier than any feast. Their knees brushed beneath the table, their eyes met over steaming cups, and each small gesture carried more meaning than silence could contain. The older sister passed him bread, her hand grazing his with a steadiness that lingered like unspoken promise. The younger poured his coffee, her gaze flicking up briefly, enough to warm him more than the drink itself. These were no longer strangers in his cabin. They were the pulse of it, the quiet, beating heart that gave the wood and stone the shape of home. He set about his chores with renewed energy, but he no longer worked alone. The women followed him down to the spring, carrying pails, their moccasins sinking into the damp earth, their laughter rare but low and soothing when the goats nosed too curiously at the bundles they carried. The older sister hauled both pails back at once, her bare calves splashed with mud, her movements strong and sure. He caught himself watching her, his eyes tracing the strength of her frame, before turning away with a heat rising in his chest. The younger one bent gracefully to gather kindling, her fingers deft and swift, hair falling loose as she tucked strands behind her ear. He nearly spoke to tell her she didn't need to, but stopped when he realized she already knew. She was not doing it out of obligation, but as part of a quiet choice, a shared weaving of life together. By midday, the cabin no longer looked like a place for one. The floor was swept clean, the table wiped to a soft sheen, their damp dresses hung neatly near the stove, and his patched shirt rested folded on the peg, mended with neat stitches. He realized then how easily life had shifted, how quickly silence had become presence, how naturally 3 lives had begun to take root together. Even the air felt different, filled with the hum of work and the unspoken healing of belonging. Still, he could not ignore the weight pressing at the edges. The town's whispers would come, men would stare, their suspicion cutting sharper than knives. He knew this. Yet, when he glanced at the sisters sitting together on the bench outside the cabin in the late sun, one with her gaze fixed firmly on the horizon, the other curled close with knees drawn up, watching goats move along the fence line, he understood that whatever danger lay ahead, he would not send them away. Their presence had become a thread in his life too tightly woven to tear free. That evening, as shadows stretched long across the ridge, he did not lay his blanket on the floor. Instead, he spread it closer to the bed, leaving space but no longer keeping distance. The fire dimmed, the night hummed low with cicadas, and the younger sister reached down, her hand brushing his arm, not as a gesture of pity or hesitation, but as a quiet affirmation. They were no longer visitors. They belonged. The older one, lying above, shifted just enough to let the edge of her blanket fall over his shoulder once more, a silent echo of the first night, yet warmer now, steadier, carrying not just kindness, but intent. He lay awake for a long while, staring at the beams overhead, his body caught between exhaustion and a restless awareness that something greater had begun. For years he had endured nights heavy with emptiness. Now the sound of their breathing steadied him, softened the weight in his chest, healed wounds he had long stopped naming. This small cabin, fragile as it was, had become the beginning of a life reshaped, not by grand speeches or promises, but by the simple, profound truth of being together. When morning returned sharp and clear, with the sky washed in deep blue, he knew the world outside would soon intrude. Supplies were running low, and the trip into town could no longer be delayed. He told them after breakfast, expecting resistance, perhaps fear. But the older sister only said, "We'll come," her voice calm, her eyes unwavering. The younger one nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the table as though anchoring herself. He hesitated, thinking of the stares, the whispers, the possible danger. Yet when he looked at them, he understood. They had chosen to return, and they had chosen him. There was no hiding from what the world might say. He nodded once, heavy but sure. "Be ready soon." As he stepped out to hitch the mule, the weight of years of solitude seemed to lift, replaced by something more formidable and more tender. The road to town would not be kind, but with the sisters beside him, the silence of his life had finally broken. And though he knew shadows waited beyond the ridge, he also knew the healing warmth of love had begun to root in him like spring after drought. The world could stare, the world could whisper, but for the first time he no longer cared. The wagon wheels would turn, carrying them not just to town, but into a future that none of them had dared imagine. And it was there, amid dust, suspicion, and danger, that the fragile flame of their bond would be tested and burn brighter still. The road stretched long and quiet beneath the morning sun, its surface pale with dust, lined with cottonwoods that whispered softly in the wind. The mule pulled steady, hooves striking the gravel with a rhythm that seemed to echo the steady beating of his heart. He sat at the front of the wagon, reins loose in his calloused hands, the older sister beside him, her braid swaying against her back as her gaze fixed firmly ahead. The younger one sat in the wagon bed, wrapped in a blanket, her knees drawn close, eyes flicking to every detail of the land, as if memorizing its contours. For years he had travelled this path alone, the creak of leather and the grind of wheels his only companions. Now, with them beside him, the silence felt different, softer, richer, filled with a warmth that reached into the spaces inside him he had long thought empty. When they reached the trading post, the yard was already alive with sound, the neighing of horses, the scrape of boots, the chatter of ranchers exchanging news. The man felt every eye turn as he helped the sisters down, their moccasins stirring the dust, their dresses still worn from travel, but their presence steady. The air thickened with curiosity, suspicion, and something harsher beneath. He did not flinch. With the older sister walking tall at his side and the younger close enough for her shoulder to brush his arm, he stepped into the store as though they had always belonged together. Inside, the keeper's gaze shifted uneasily between them, his wife whispering low from the back. The man kept his voice calm but strong as he listed what he needed: flour, salt, oil, thread. He did not hurry, did not lower his eyes. The younger sister quietly placed a small tin of needles on the counter, and though she said nothing, her action carried a message clear as words. They were not burdens here, not strays, but part of the life he was building. He let it stand, and when the order was tallied, he spoke clearly enough for all to hear. "Put it on my account." With those words, he marked them as his family, in a way that no whisper could undo. Outside, two young men leaned against the hitch rail, their laughter sharp, their words low but poisoned. One muttered something indecent, his grin wide. The man met his eyes with a gaze hard as stone, unblinking, and the grin faltered, slipping into silence. The older sister stood tall beside him, her chin lifted, daring the world to speak against her. The younger stayed close, her fingers hooked lightly into the back of the wagon, a quiet tether of trust and belonging. Together they loaded the supplies and left the town behind. The sound of gossip following them like dust stirred into the air. The ride home was quiet but steady. The mule's harness creaked, the road stretched on, and the man's thoughts pressed heavy in his chest. He knew the talk would spread before sundown. He knew trouble would come. Yet when he looked beside him at the older sister's calm profile, when he turned back to see the younger seated cross-legged with a hand resting protectively on the sack of flour, he felt no regret. The silence that once gnawed at him now wrapped around them like a shield, softening the ache of years alone. He had chosen, and they had chosen, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. That evening, when the supplies were stacked against the cabin wall, the three of them sat around the small table with cups of coffee. The fire glowed warm, shadows playing against the walls, and for the first time, the cabin did not feel like three people gathered by chance. It felt like a home being claimed. He reached for the tobacco tin, set it on the table, and laid the strip of old beads beside the new one the sisters had brought. The older sister met his gaze directly, her voice quiet but certain when she said, "We didn't come for quiet." The younger one nodded, her hand brushing close to his, the warmth of her touch steady as a vow. The following days passed with a fragile rhythm. Chores carried them from morning into dusk, mending fences, hauling water, sweeping floors, patching garments. Their voices remained low, practical, yet each word was a thread binding them closer. At night, the cabin glowed with firelight, and the silence between them no longer felt like emptiness, but like trust. Yet he knew the peace would not last. The stares in town, the whispers by the rail, the sharp laughter that hid malice. These were seeds that would soon bear fruit. And so, when dust rose on the road late one afternoon and three riders came slow toward the cabin, he was not surprised. He stepped onto the porch, his voice even as he greeted them, though the sight of the crooked deputy's badge pinned to the lead man's chest made his pulse tighten. Questions came sharp. Rumors of raids, accusations of stock stolen, suspicions aimed not at him but at the women within his home. He could have sent them away, told them to hide, denied their presence. Instead, he stood firm, shoulders squared, and said what needed saying. "They're not wanted here, and they're not going anywhere." Behind him, the floor creaked. The older sister stepped into the doorway, arms crossed, chin lifted high. The younger stood just inside, clutching the kettle though it was empty, her knuckles white. He felt the weight of their eyes on him as he spoke, and though his chest tightened, he did not waver. The deputy narrowed his eyes, but the man's voice stayed flat, steady as stone. "I'm sure." The riders measured him, measured the cabin, measured the women who stood unflinching in its doorway. Finally, the deputy gave a curt nod and turned his horse, muttering about returning. The hooves faded into the distance, and only then did the man exhale, the breath long and heavy, leaving his body like a burden dropped. The older sister stepped closer, her shoulder nearly brushing his, her eyes calm but sharp. "They will come back," she said. "Maybe," he answered, "but they'll find the same answer next time." Inside, the younger sister set the kettle down, her hands trembling enough to spill water on the floor. He crossed to her, laid his hand gently on her shoulder, and felt her steady under his touch. She did not flinch. She met his eyes, and for the first time since their return, she smiled faintly, a fragile curve of lips that struck him deeper than any words. It was the smile of someone who knew she was no longer alone, who had found shelter in the heart of another. That night, the rifle leaned near the door, not as a threat, but as a promise. The latch was left open, not from neglect, but from defiance. and as the fire hissed low, he lay down on the floor, his body warmed not by blankets alone, but by the sound of their breathing nearby, by the unspoken vow that whatever came down that road, they would not face it apart. Morning would bring its own weight, but for that night, the cabin glowed with quiet strength, a sanctuary forged of firelight, trust, and the healing warmth of three souls bound together. The desert beyond could whisper, the town could talk, the riders could return. But within those four walls, something had taken root that no storm could wash away. And as dawn crept near, he felt not fear, but readiness, the kind that comes when a man has something worth protecting and knows he will never again stand alone. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm that felt deceptively calm, as if the land itself wished to grant them a brief reprieve. The man rose earlier than he once had, stepping outside before the ridge caught the sun, his eyes scanning the road for dust, for hooves, for any sign that trouble had returned. Most mornings the horizon lay empty, the only sound the distant murmur of coyotes fading into silence. That silence, once his prison, now felt like a fragile gift. He breathed it in deeply before returning to the cabin, where the scent of ground corn and wood smoke already warmed the air. Inside, the older sister worked the grinding stone, her forearms steady with each turn, her hair falling loose over her shoulder. The younger crouched by the wood box, stacking kindling into neat rows, her concentration so intent that she hummed softly without realizing. Their presence filled the small room in ways words could not, turning emptiness into life, turning weariness into something healing. They began to move as though they had always belonged there. When he carried planks to mend the goat pen, the older sister followed with twine, driving the stakes into the earth with firm, practiced blows. Her shoulders flexed with strength, and when he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, he found her watching him with the same calm steadiness she carried everywhere, as if measuring his resolve. The younger carried the twine line behind them, her fingers looping it quick and clever, her laughter, light, surprising, spilling out when the goats nosed through their work. It startled him, that sound, sharp and sweet as water striking stone. He caught himself smiling back before he knew it, warmth rising in his chest like dawn after too many nights of cold. At the spring, when the younger sister slipped on wet wood, he caught her instinctively, his hands circling her waist, her back pressed against his chest. For a breathless moment neither moved, her heart beat fast under his palms, her hair damp against his cheek. She looked over her shoulder at him, not startled, not shamed, but steady, her eyes meeting his with a calm that carried far more than words. Then she stepped forward, composed, leaving him to feel the echo of her closeness burning in his skin long after she had gone. Later, when he returned to the cabin, he found the older sister sitting in the doorway, mending one of his shirts. Her hands moved steady, the needle flashing in the light. She looked up once, her gaze sharp, then softened into something quieter when she saw the damp hem of her sister's dress. Their voices in Apache, low and private, carried an intimacy he could not break. Yet when the younger smiled faintly at him before turning back to the pot over the fire, he felt himself included in that intimacy, as though the distance between them had thinned. By night, the cabin seemed to draw tighter, filled with the warmth of fire and bodies near. He oiled hinges at the table while the younger set his coffee down, her hand brushing his. This time she did not pull away. Their lips met in a kiss, soft as breath, cautious but sure. When they broke apart, the older sister watched from across the room, her gaze unreadable, her silence heavy. Then she stepped forward, placed her hand on his jaw, and kissed him too. Slow, deliberate, carrying no anger, only an agreement as profound as any vow. The air shifted then, no longer uncertain, but marked by the unspoken truth that they had chosen him, and he them. No words sealed it, but none were needed. The warmth between them belonged not to chance, but to something older, stronger, written in silence and survival. That night, the fire burned low, the door left unlatched, the desert air drifting soft across the floorboards. The man lay with their breathing close, their hands brushing his, their warmth turning the long ache of solitude into something healed. The cabin, once a place of exile, had become a sanctuary. He closed his eyes, knowing that for the first time in many years the darkness carried no weight. But the days were not free of shadows. Word had spread through town, whispers curled like smoke in corners, questions pressed against his back like stones. Men watched too long at the trading post, their smirks edged with cruelty, their silences heavier than words. And soon, as he had expected, trouble returned. Riders came slow down the road one evening, dust rising behind them, the deputy's badge crooked on his chest, his voice carrying accusation before he had even dismounted. The man met them at the gate, his voice calm, but iron steady. "Travelers come and go. No trouble here." Yet the riders pressed, their suspicion sharpened by prejudice, their eyes lingering on the shadows moving inside the cabin. The choice was there, heavy in his throat. Deny them, send the women away, or stand firm. He stood firm. "They're not going anywhere," he said, each word a stone laid into the foundation of something larger than himself. The tension stretched long, the riders measuring him, measuring the cabin, measuring the women who stood in the doorway with unflinching eyes. At last they turned their horses, threats left hanging in the dust behind them. When silence fell again, it was heavy, but shared. The older sister stepped close, her shoulder brushing his, her face calm but fierce. "They will come back," she said softly. He nodded. "And they'll find the same answer." Inside, the younger set the kettle down with trembling hands, and when he touched her shoulder, she steadied, looking at him with a faint, fragile smile that spoke more than gratitude. It spoke of trust, of belonging, of love growing in the spaces once filled by fear. That night, the rifle leaned near the door, the latch left open, the fire crackling steady. The man lay on the floor as before, but now the weight of blankets and the brush of hands against his arm carried a promise greater than any weapon, that they would not run, would not hide, would not face the road alone. And as dawn crept soft and golden over the ridge, he knew that the storm was not finished. Yet he also knew this: the silence of his life had been broken, healed by the presence of two souls who had chosen to return. Whatever came, he would meet it not with emptiness, but with the strength of a bond forged in firelight, in trust, in the quiet, unshakable warmth of love. The days stretched into weeks, and the cabin grew into something it had never been before. It was no longer a solitary shelter against the harshness of the land, but a place where voices softened the silence, where hands worked side by side, and where the warmth of shared breath turned the nights into healing comfort. The man built a narrow cot from pine slats so no one would sleep on the floor again. The sisters smoothed the rough boards with sand and stitched curtains from flour sacks, giving the cabin corners of privacy it had never known. The younger sister organized their belongings, folding shirts, stacking tools, arranging boots neatly by the door. Each act was quiet, but it wove a deeper bond, transforming bare necessity into a sense of permanence. Evenings became gentle rituals. Bread passed between them, beans spooned from the same pot, knees brushing under the table with no hesitation. Their words were still few, yet their silences carried weight, no longer heavy with loneliness, but filled with understanding. He spoke of ridges where the firewood was best, of the goats that needed new fencing, of rains that might come early. The older sister listened with the sharp calm of someone who measured the world with care, her gaze steady, her answers brief but certain. The younger sister laughed more often now, her smile curving soft as spring light. Once her laughter startled him so much he stopped mid-sentence, staring as though hearing music he had forgotten existed. That sound lingered in his chest long after it faded. One evening, while the door stood open to let in the warm breeze, he sat sharpening a hatchet, the rasp of stone steady against the blade. The sisters sat together braiding their hair, the firelight casting their profiles in gold. The younger finished first, rose, and crossed the room. She knelt beside him, her eyes following the slow circle of his hand against steel. When he looked up, her face was close, closer than he expected, and before words could form, she leaned in and kissed him. It was soft, certain, and when she did not pull back, his hand found her side, gentle, steady, as though holding on to something he had waited years to find. The older sister rose, stepping near with quiet grace. There was no jealousy in her face, no anger. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes searching his, her expression almost solemn. Then she leaned down and kissed him too, slow and deliberate, carrying not possession but agreement, a vow spoken without words. In that moment, the air shifted. The weight of hesitation, of uncertainty, of silence broke apart, replaced by something undeniable. They had chosen one another, each of them, and the bond was no longer fragile. It was rooted, whole, unshakable. That night, the bed and cot held them without crowding, their blankets spread wide, the lantern burning low. The door stood unlatched, not as defiance, but as trust, the fire hissing low, the desert wind carrying the sound of coyotes into the room. Their closeness was not hurried, not secret, but open, steady, born of survival, of loyalty, of love too deep to be measured by words. In the darkness, their hands found each other, their breathing steady, their warmth a healing against every wound the world had carved into them. The man lay awake, staring at the rafters, listening to their hearts beside him, and for the first time in years he felt joy rise unbidden, so quiet it nearly frightened him. The next morning he found himself whistling under his breath while hauling water from the spring, something he had not done since he was a boy. When he returned, the sisters were already cooking and mending, their hair loose, their laughter low as they worked together. The smell of bread and coffee filled the air, and he caught himself thinking, "This is what a home should be." Not walls and roof alone, but people moving within it, giving it breath, giving it soul. Yet the shadow of riders lingered at the edge of his mind. He knew they would return. Trouble never stayed gone for long in this land, not when whispers and suspicion rode faster than truth. But the thought no longer filled him with dread. Instead, it filled him with certainty. Whatever came, he would stand, not alone, but with them. The sisters had not asked for promises, but he had made one silently, to himself, to the desert sky, to the strip of beads still resting in the tobacco tin. No one would take them from him, not lawmen, not riders, not gossiping tongues. That evening, as the sun dropped in blood-red streaks behind the ridge, he stood by the rows of green shoots they had planted together. His hand brushed over the tender leaves pushing through the soil, fragile yet determined. Behind him, the sisters stood in the doorway, watching, their faces soft in the glow of dusk. For a moment, it struck him how far they had come, from 2 starving children crouched in the wash to 2 women building life beside him. He turned, met their eyes, and felt the truth settle deep in his chest. The cabin, the land, the love that bound them. It was no longer his alone. It belonged to all 3. The peace would not last, not in a land where men clung to suspicion like a weapon. But as he walked back toward the cabin, its door still unlatched, its fire waiting steady within, he knew this. No storm, no whisper, no rider could erase what had begun. Whatever came down the road, they would meet it together, bound by a love as steady and unyielding as the desert itself. The peace they carved out in that small cabin did not vanish with the first shadow of trouble. It deepened, like roots taking hold beneath stone. The days began with sunlight spilling across the ridge, painting the land in gold, and ended with firelight glowing warm against the cabin walls. The man woke each morning with a steadiness he had never known before, no longer rising to fight emptiness, but to share breath, labor, and silence that felt alive. He walked the rows of young shoots they had planted, the sisters often beside him, their voices low as they spoke of soil, of weather, of the simple rhythms of tending life. What had once been only survival had transformed into something tender, something healing. The cabin no longer held one man against the loneliness of the desert. It held a family, shaped not by law or blood, but by choice and devotion. The town did not stop whispering. At the trading post, voices still dropped when they walked in, eyes still lingered too long. Men muttered by the hitch rail, their laughter edged with scorn. But each time the man stood firm, the sisters at his side, and together they defied the weight of judgment. He settled his accounts in a voice clear enough for all to hear, each word carrying not just defiance but belonging. And though the whispers spread, though riders came and went with suspicion in their eyes, the bond inside the cabin never wavered. If anything, the shadows pressing against them only sharpened the light they carried together. At home, their life wove itself into a tapestry of simple moments that carried more beauty than he had ever thought possible. The older sister bent over a wash basin, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the curve of her jaw strong as she worked. The younger laughed when goats nosed through the garden rows, her smile quick as sunlight breaking through clouds. In the evenings, they sat around the table he had built with his own hands, the wood worn smooth beneath their fingers. Bread passed, coffee poured, hands brushed across the boards. Sometimes the older one would lean against his shoulder, her presence grounding like stone. Sometimes the younger would rest her hand on his, soft and certain, her eyes shining in the lantern glow. And often they both reached for him at once, their touch a wordless vow that none of them would ever face the road alone again. Nights brought closeness that was no longer uncertain, but chosen with clarity. The cot and the bed side by side, blankets shared, the fire low, the door left unlatched. Their bodies moved together with the ease of those who had shed fear, who had claimed one another fully. There was no jealousy, no shame, only the quiet truth that love can take many forms, and that healing often blooms in the most unexpected places. When he lay awake afterward, listening to their breathing steady in the darkness, he felt the weight of years of solitude fall away, replaced by a sense of belonging so deep it stilled every ache inside him. And in the heart of it all was a promise, unspoken, yet absolute. He had been given a second chance at life, not through riches or victory, but through kindness, patience, and the courage to stand beside those whom the world would cast aside. The sisters had chosen him, and he had chosen them, and together they had built something the desert could not erase. Their love was not loud or showy, but it was fierce, steady, and eternal, a flame sheltered against the wind, burning brighter with every passing season. As the years stretched forward, he no longer counted them in loneliness. Each season brought new growth to the land they tended, laughter to the small home they shared, and strength to the bond they had forged in silence and struggle. And when the wind swept across the ridge at night, carrying with it the howl of coyotes and the hush of sage, he no longer heard emptiness in it. He heard a song of endurance, of love that had endured the hunger of children, the silence of years, and the suspicion of men, and had come out unbroken. The desert was vast, the world still harsh, but their cabin glowed with warmth. It was no longer the shelter of a solitary man, it was the heart of a family, a sanctuary against storms, a place where healing had taken root and love had grown strong. Whatever came down the road, they would meet it together, hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, their hearts bound by choice, by loyalty, by a love greater than fear. If this story touched a quiet corner of your heart, if it brought you even a moment of warmth or healing, I invite you to let that feeling linger. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you can walk with me through more stories of love, resilience, and hope. Every word you share keeps this fire alive, and together we can carry these gentle tales further into the world.